It is 367 AD. A Roman soldier, shivering on the ramparts of Hadrian's Wall, peers north into the fog. He is not afraid of Scots. He is not afraid of Gales. He is terrified of the Picti, the painted people. For centuries, they were the nightmare on the edge of the Roman Empire, the enigmatic warriors of Caledonia who refused to be conquered. They built no cities. They left no written histories. Their only legacy was carved onto massive cryptic stones. Serpents, wolves, crescent moons, and a strange, unearthly creature known as the Pictish Beast. And then, around 900 AD, they vanished. Their name disappears from the chronicles. Their language goes silent. Their unique symbolic art stops. The land of Pictland is replaced seemingly overnight by the new kingdom of Alba, the Gaelic name for Scotland. How does an entire nation, a people who defied the legions of Rome, simply disappear from history? It's a pattern we've seen before. In Eastern Europe, entire nations like the Goths, Scythians, and Thracians vanished, seemingly erased from the map and replaced by a new people called the Slavs. The disappearance of the Picts is Britain's version of this great historical magic trick. For over a millennium, this has been one of Europe's greatest historical mysteries. Were they massacred? Did they flee? Or were they, like the Goths, simply rebranded? The chronicles were silent. The stones held their secrets. History had failed to provide an answer. But now, science has. In just the last few years, DNA pulled from the acidic, unforgiving soil of Pictish graves has finally cracked the case. And the answer is more profound than any historian dared to guess. This is the story of how science solved the mystery of Europe's lost painted peoples. To understand their disappearance, we must first understand how strange their existence was. The name Picti was a Roman invention. It was a pejorative, a nickname given by the general Eumenius in 297 AD, and it literally means the painted ones. Roman orators and poets loved this image. They described savage warriors covered in tattoos or blue woad paint, charging naked into battle. This was likely propaganda, designed to portray the peoples north of the wall as barbarians, the ultimate other. But who were they really? They were not one tribe. Like the Gauls facing Caesar or the Germans facing Marius, the Picts were a confederation of tribes, the Caledonii, the Vercerones, the Teuxali, who united when threatened. They inhabited the lands we now call eastern and northern Scotland, from Fife up to the Shetland Islands. For centuries, they were Rome's most persistent problem in Britain. They were part of the Great Conspiracy of 367 AD, a coordinated attack that nearly broke Roman Britain. They were the reason Hadrian built his wall, and the reason the Antonine Wall was abandoned. They were, in short, a resilient, highly organized, and successful warrior society. And yet, they left us almost nothing. Or rather, they left nothing we can easily understand. The Picts were the ultimate unwritten people. While the Irish were writing epic poems and the Anglo-Saxons were writing law codes, the Picts wrote nothing. Not a single text, not a single chronicle in their own language has survived. All we have are the stones. Scattered across Scotland are over 350 of these incredible monoliths. They're carved with a complex, recurring vocabulary of symbols: a crescent and V-rod, a double disc and Z-rod, a swimming elephant, often called the Pictish Beast, eagles, salmon, wolves, and intricate geometric knots. For centuries, scholars have stared at these stones, desperate to unlock their meaning. Are they a language? A form of hieroglyphics? Are they astronomical markers? Are they religious icons? The most compelling theory is that they are genealogical. that each symbol represents a lineage, a clan, or a noble house. That these stones are in fact complex family trees, marking territory and marriage alliances. But the truth is, we don't know. They are a code we cannot crack. This is the Pictish enigma, a society strong enough to stop Rome, sophisticated enough to create this unique and complex art, but who remained stubbornly silent to history. Their stones are the markers of a powerful, confident culture. So how does a culture like that, one that defined a nation for over 500 years, simply cease to be? The end of Pictland begins with a new kind of terror. Around 793 AD, the first Viking longships appeared. They came from the east, from Norway, and they hit Pictland like a storm. While the Anglo-Saxons in the south had to deal with Danish Vikings, the Picts faced the Norwegians, who used Pictland as a staging ground for their raids on Ireland and their colonization of Iceland. The Pictish heartlands in the north, Orkney, Shetland, and the mainland, were devastated. The Pictish kingdom of Fortriu, once the dominant power, was shattered by a massive Viking invasion in 839 AD. As the Picts faced this existential threat from the east, a new power was rising to their west. This was the kingdom of Dalriata. Its people were the Scoti, or Scots, Gaelic-speaking immigrants who had come from Ireland centuries earlier and settled the western coast of Scotland. The Picts were now caught in a vice. The Vikings were hammering them from the east, the Scots were a rival power to the west. Their world was shrinking, their power base collapsing. And it is here, in the smoke and chaos of the Viking Age, that one man steps onto the stage, Cyned mac Alpine, known to history as Kenneth MacAlpin. Around the year 843 AD, something in history snaps. The chronicles, written mostly by Irish and English monks, tell us that Kenneth MacAlpin, a Gael, a king of Dalriata, also became the king of the Picts. Within 2 generations, the entire cultural landscape had been rewritten. The Gaelic language of the Scots replaced the unknown Pictish tongue. The Pictish symbol stones ceased to be carved, replaced by Celtic high crosses. The very name Pictland vanished, replaced by the Gaelic name Alba. The Picts, as a distinct people, were gone, and Kenneth MacAlpin and his descendants, the House of Alpin, would be known as the first kings of the new unified kingdom of Scotland. But how did this happen? This is the central mystery. The historical sources are thin, and they are biased. They tell us what happened, but not why. For centuries, 2 competing theories dominated. Theory 1, the MacAlpin's treason theory. This is the stuff of dark legend. One chronicle, the life of Saint Cathro, and later myths, tell of a brutal conquest. The story goes that Kenneth MacAlpin invited the 7 remaining Pictish nobles to a great feast at Scone. As they said, he pulled hidden bolts, dropping the Picts into spike-filled pits below. He then proceeded to systematically massacre the entire Pictish nobility, a brutal genocide that erased their leadership and allowed him to seize their kingdom. Theory 2, the peaceful inheritance theory. This theory is more complex. It relies on a peculiarity of Pictish society mentioned by the Venerable Bede, an English monk. The Picts may have been matrilineal. This means they may have traced their lineage and, crucially, their royal succession through the mother's line. If this is true, Kenneth MacAlpin didn't need to conquer the Picts. He may have had a Pictish mother. His claim to the Pictish throne may have been just as, or even more, legitimate than his claim to the Scottish one. He wasn't a conqueror, he was a unifier. A man who, by a quirk of genetics and politics, legally inherited both kingdoms. For centuries, historians were stuck in this debate. Was it a bloody genocide or a peaceful political merger? The stones were silent. The chronicles were contradictory. The only witnesses left were the dead. And it would take 1,100 years for science to finally make them talk. Extracting DNA from ancient bones is always difficult, but extracting it from Pictish graves is a special kind of hell. There were two major problems. First, the Picts, unlike the Vikings or Anglo-Saxons, were not often buried with a rich array of grave goods. This makes it hard to definitively identify a skeleton as Pictish versus any other person living in Scotland. Second, the Scottish soil is notoriously acidic. The same peaty bogs that preserve bog bodies can, in other places, completely dissolve bone over centuries, and it shreds complex molecules like DNA. For decades, the Picts remained stubbornly genetically invisible. But in the last few years, technological breakthroughs in ancient DNA, aDNA analysis, have changed everything. By focusing on the densest part of the skeleton, the petrous part of the temporal bone in the inner ear, scientists can now retrieve genetic data from remains that were once thought lost forever. A series of groundbreaking studies, culminating in a major 2023 paper in the journal Current Biology, finally achieved the impossible. They successfully sequenced the full genomes of multiple individuals buried in Pictish-era cemeteries. The first question: who were the Picts? Were they, as some old legends claimed, Scythians from the Black Sea, or Thracians or some other exotic invader? The DNA answer was definitive: no. The Pictish genomes showed that they were the direct descendants of the local native British Iron Age populations. They were, in effect, the original Britons, the people who lived in Scotland before the Romans ever arrived. Their closest genetic relatives were not some far-off Scythian tribe, but the other Iron Age peoples of Britain, like the ancient Welsh and Cornish. The mystery of their origin was solved. They were not outsiders, they were the indigenous people of the land. The next question: what about the matrilineal theory? Could DNA prove that the Picts traced their lineage through their mothers? This is where it gets fascinating. A 2021 study by Adeline Morez looked at this exact question. The team compared mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is passed down only from the mother, with Y chromosome DNA, yDNA, passed down only from the father. In a patrilineal society, where men stay put and women move to marry them, you would expect to see low diversity in yDNA, but high diversity in mtDNA. The Pictish graves showed something tantalizingly different. They found high diversity in the female lines, mtDNA, but a more concentrated related grouping in the male lines, yDNA. This seems to contradict the matrilineal theory. Or does it? Some scholars argue this data fits a complex matrilocal model, where women from many different lineages, high mtDNA diversity, stayed in their home communities, and men, both local Picts and outsiders, like the Gaels, Britons, or even Vikings, would move into those communities to marry and gain power. This would still place the right to rule in the hands of the Pictish women, making the matrilineal theory more, not less, plausible. The science here is complex, but it hints at the very social structure that would allow an outsider like Kenneth MacAlpin, if his mother was Pictish, to inherit the throne. But all of this paled in comparison to the final, critical question, the one that could solve the entire mystery. What happened to their DNA? Did it vanish? Were they replaced? The science team took the newly sequenced ancient Pictish genomes and compared them to the DNA of thousands of people living in Scotland, England, and Ireland. This was the moment of truth. If MacAlpin's treason was true, if the Picts were massacred and replaced by the Gaels, their unique genetic signature would vanish from the record. The DNA of modern Scots would look like the DNA of the ancient Irish Gaels, with no Pictish component. The results came back, and they were astonishing. There was no replacement. There was no genocide. The DNA of the ancient Picts is still there. It's not just there, it is the dominant ancestral component of modern people living in Scotland. Especially in the east and north, the traditional Pictish heartlands. The genetic continuity from the Iron Age through the Pictish period to the present day is clear and unbroken. The Picts did not vanish. They were not erased. They are, in fact, the Scottish people.
So, we have a paradox. The DNA proves the Pictish people survived, but the history proves their culture died. Their language vanished, their art stopped, their name was wiped from the map. How can both be true? How do a people survive while their identity is erased? The answer is that this was not a genocide. It was a culturation. It was a cultural assimilation, a rebranding, driven by a perfect storm of crisis and political genius. Let's look at the evidence. The MacAlpin's treason theory is almost certainly a myth, a piece of dark folklore. The peaceful inheritance theory is plausible, but it's not the whole story. The real story, supported by the DNA, is far more complex. It's not a story of replacement, but of transformation. This brings us back to the parallel we drew at the very beginning. This disappearance is not unique. Remember Eastern Europe, 650 AD. The Goths, the Scythians, the Thracians all vanished, replaced by the Slavs. But as we now know from the same genetic science, this was an illusion. The DNA of the Goths of Poland didn't disappear. It lives on in modern Poles. The DNA of the Thracians of the Balkans didn't disappear. It forms the bedrock of modern Serbs and Bulgarians. It was not a genetic replacement, it was a cultural one. A new language, a new way of farming, a new identity, proved so successful and so adaptable that it overwrote the old identities, while the people themselves, the bloodlines, remained. Now look back at Scotland. It is the exact same process. The Picts were not conquered by the Scots. The Picts became the Scots. Here is the most likely scenario. The devastating Viking raids of the 9th century broke the old Pictish political structure. Their kingdom, Fortriu, was shattered. They were facing an existential crisis. At that exact moment, their neighbors, the Gaelic-speaking Scots, had a leader, Kenneth MacAlpin, who may have had a legitimate claim to both thrones. A union born of crisis was formed. But in this new unified kingdom of Alba, one culture had to be dominant, and the Gaelic culture of the Scots won. Why? Because the Scots had something the Picts didn't. They were tied to the wider Gaelic world of Ireland, a world of powerful monasteries, of scribes, of literature, and crucially, of a version of Christianity that was spreading rapidly. The Gaelic language and the Roman Church it brought became the language of power, of progress, and of God. If you were a Pictish lord in 900 AD, you faced a choice. You could cling to your old pagan-influenced symbols and your unwritten language, or you could adopt the new, prestigious Gaelic language. You could send your son to a Gaelic monastery. You could marry into the new Gaelic-speaking elite. To survive, to thrive, to be part of the future, you had to become Scottish. It was a cultural takeover, not a genetic one. The Pictish language, with no scribes to write it down, simply withered and died, replaced by Gaelic within a few generations. The symbol stones, relics of a pagan past, were abandoned. The disappearance of the Picts was an illusion. It was the most successful political merger in history. An entire nation agreed to change its name, its language, and its identity in order to survive. The DNA has proven unequivocally that the Picts were not a lost people. They were a founding people. They didn't just vanish into the mist. They built a new house, and over time, they simply changed the name on the door. The painted warriors of Rome's nightmares are not gone. They are still here, hidden in plain sight, in the blood, bone, and DNA of the modern Scottish people.